Karim sir, you can see my screen, right?
Your screen is fine, Nishant.
Yeah, thanks, Vinay. You want to try the live?
You're already live. We are already live, Nishant.
Thanks, Vinay.
Yeah, Vinay, can you keep accepting participants who are joining? I'll just check this.
Hi, Vinay.
Hi, Deepak.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Alex, just a minute. I'm trying to sort your.
Good evening to all the participants that have joined. Requesting you to please be on mute for a smoother session. We will begin shortly. As you can see, this talk is also live on YouTube. So if any of your friends are not able to join, you can just tell me that I've emailed them. All of the people who have registered, I've emailed the YouTube link. Thank you.
Nishant, I think you can start.
Sir, you want me to start?
Yeah, he has 2 slides. Milind has 2 slides, it seems. He said.
Okay. Is he joining? Can we start after he joins?
I think he joined. No.
I'm here, Nishant.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Just a moment, sir. Just a minute.
Yeah.
Good evening to one and all who have joined, and I'm sure we can see that there are a lot of people outside India as well. So warm greetings to you on this wonderful occasion. Welcome to the 5th lecture as part of the Global Research webinar series. This series was done with an objective to have a common platform where researchers from across the world can come and share with us their experiences and also the knowledge that they have gained. So today's topic is traditional plant management for resource sovereignty. And we have with us Dr. Alex. I'm really happy to have, we are all very happy that he has given the time to join us today, even though it's very early for him, early in the morning. So we all know that resource sovereignty is a big question in today's world, and it has been discussed from the United Nations from the early 1950s, where they introduced the principle of sovereignty over natural resources. And indigenous people as well have their own perspective on cultural property, which can be truly protected when their own legal systems are applied. So in today's world, where this is such an important topic, here we have with us Dr. Alex, who will be sharing the perspective of traditional management as resource sovereignty. So we are all looking forward to the talk. And to begin with, I would request Dr. Abdul Karim, head to the Center for Conservation of Natural Resources, TDU, to just introduce about TDU and speak a few words about on this occasion. Over to you, sir. Sir, you're on mute. Karim, sir, you're on mute.
Thank you, Nishant. I'm very happy that this series is going on from, and I could see overwhelmed responsible. I mean, many people are trying to really come on board on both aspect of learning and even giving the knowledge to the young researchers, professors, lecturers from different universities. It is really coming out well, and we'll continue this series for a long time. And I'll just take I'll not take a lot of time. Just take a few minutes on just introducing about what TRU is, how it has evolved. So just our center, which we call as a foundation for revitalization of local health tradition, is a foundation which was been first initiated and started on the process which the university has grown. So this foundation is been recognized, or is been, we could say, as a see the milestone achievements that we have done is on establishing the medicinal plant conservation areas all over the country, around 110, where rare, endangered, threatened species have been conserved. This has been done through the State Forest Department from all over the states of the country. That's one thing which is a milestone achievement this organization has really done from 1993. And we also have a database on medicinal plants, which has almost all information, starting from its habitat to users to distribution to its classical information literatures, a series of entire database for more than 6,000 and odd species we have information with.
Karim, sir, you there?
I wonder if it froze.
Okay. We'll just sort this out. Just give us a minute. Just a reminder to all the participants to be on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, Nishan? Yeah. Could you hear us?
Now I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you, sir. Yes.
Okay, fine. Then, yes, the center also, the institute has also established a unique science lab, which has been linking with the traditional knowledge with science. is a unique thing which has been established, and you can see the different researches which is happening here. And also for the local knowledge has concern in the country, where the local health tradition is established, which is an oral tradition, for where this university or this foundation in turn has tried and brought a unique policy for this ethnic knowledge people who are the local healers in the village. And it is also established the different associations on this healers wherever is there in the country. And at the same time, we are also trying to document the manuscripts which are lying inside in the villages, in the institutes, in the Oriental libraries which are there. We are trying to see that what are the medicinal manuscripts are there, and trying to see that we are cataloging it. And also, this institute also is a pioneer in establishing the home herbal gardens in such a way that the health reliance has been taken care, the livelihood has been taken care by millions of people in the country. So how to establish a home herbal garden, and home herbal garden has been established all over the country. And also, we are trying to see that the traditional ethno-veterinary practices has been documented, at the same time trained with the different veterinary practitioners all over the country, and see that it is in the form of a course, and how this ethno-veterinary practices can be used for the animals as such, mostly for cows, sheep, goats, and also for wild animals, how we can really treat this. So this has a separate center on it, this institution. And also we could see that in the case of government national policies and action plans and different 5-year plans, the institute has really contributed in establishing different, I mean, in different policies. And also in the case of nutrition as concerned, the traditional knowledge on nutrition, especially the food knowledge, ethnic food knowledge, has been documented, and seeing that how these recipes can in turn be trained to the hotel management students all over the country, and see that how a cadre of students from the hotel management, from the hospitals, from the nutritionists, from the dietitians, with using the ethnic knowledge, how this can be used. And also we have established a hospital, which is an high quality 100-bed hospital, which is really trying to see that how the traditional knowledge and the allopathic so-called modern knowledge is trying to correlate, and see that how it can come on it. There's some of the achievements which I thought I'll highlight that. Yanishan, next slide. So the university also has now the university also has a different focal areas which we are having. I mean, developing the MSc courses and PhD courses, etc. The focal areas are in the case of conservation of medicinal plants, informatics, plant systematics, medicinal manuscripts, ethno-veterinary practices, which I mentioned, that Ayurveda clinical research, life science courses, food and nutrition, and community health. And we work with the partners, and now we have developed for this year an unique course, which along with the ATRI, which is an organization at Bangalore, working all over the country. And so I request Milind, who is from that organization, to speak a few words on this course, what we are trying to do on MSc Conservation Practice course. Yeah, Milind, to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kareem, and good to be over here. Let me see if I can just put up my slide. Okay, so just very briefly, I have a couple of minutes over here, so I don't want to take too much of your time. We are very excited about this new course that we are offering. This is a Master's in Environmental Studies with a focus on conservation practice, and the course is being organized by it's being co-organized by ATRI and TDU. A lot of you know TDU. TDU is a pioneering state university that promotes the importance of transdisciplinary knowledge and especially a lot of traditional ecological knowledge in addressing some of the concerns that we have, sustainability and environmental concerns. And for those of you who don't know, ATRI is one of the has been ranked one of the top 20 environmental think tanks in the world for many years now. And we are an organization that has over 25 years now working in the field of sustainability science and environmental conservation. And the two organizations have come together to offer this course in environmental studies. So why conservation practice? Let me start with a very simple example. I have my expertise as a scientist is in invasive alien plant species. And I have been studying these in the Western Ghats, and we've been looking at change that has taken place over the last 20, 30 years with satellite imagery, right? So that's a very technological study right there. But as we were studying it, we discovered that there are different policy implications. There is a history angle to this. How did that invasive come to that place? What were the pathways? Who introduced it? What were the policies that were in place at that time? What are the policies in place right now that need to be considered when you're talking about dealing with these species? What are the incentives that different stakeholders will have in managing invasive alien species? So anytime you look at a problem or an issue in conservation science or sustainability studies, both the faculty at TDU and faculty at ATRI and all of us who work at these organizations will tell you that these problems are best approached or best addressed when you have a framework that goes outside a narrow disciplinary silo, right? And that's why we are so excited about this course. Very briefly, we have 4 semesters that we have constructed, divided this course into, and 5 different kinds of courses. So we start all our students off with a basic in foundations, 4 different foundations that we provide in ecology, environmental science, sociology, and economics. So you can see there's a very, very wide diversity that we have over there. Then we move on to perspectives. How do people view different environmental problems, right? A community may view it differently. A government a person may view it differently. An NGO may view it differently. What are those different perspectives? Then what is the domain knowledge that in each domain, what is the kind of knowledge? How do you apply that knowledge? What are the skills that you need? And finally, a few electives. Yeah. So that's just the brief structure of the course. We're currently accepting applications. So if you're interested, please apply. There's a very strong field component as part of this course. ATRI has a large network of what we call community-based conservation centers across the country. And TDU has its medicinal plant conservation areas, and we are planning to use a lot of these for a lot of experiential and immersive learning experiences. So deadline for applications is coming up quick next weekend. So look forward to your applications, and I'll stop over there. Back to you, Kareem.
Thank you, sir, for giving that brief introduction. I'm sure there are students over here who found this interesting, and I encourage all of them to reach out to you. You can put out your email or a link in the chat box so that people who want to know more about this can quickly find out about the course. Now, to go ahead, I request now Deepa ma'am to kindly welcome Dr. Alex and also give a brief introduction about him to all the participants. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all to the Global Ethnobotany Research Webinar Series. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alex McCulley. He has a PhD from University of Wisconsin. Currently, he is working as assistant curator in the Institute of Economics Botany at the New York Botanical Garden. His specialization includes ethnobotany, traditional plant management, domestication, and agrobiodiversity. He is the authority on wild edible plants, brassica, population genomics, cropping systems, crop wild relatives, and ecology. His research focuses on the ecological and evolutionary impacts of traditional plant stewardship practices in Mexico, Ethiopia, and Canada. His dissertation research combined ethnographic interviews, genomics, and GIS to trace the origins of Brassica rapa crops, their escape from cultivation, and their adaptation as a weedy edible plant by Mexican farmers. His postdoctoral work includes in northern Ethiopia, is centered around traditional mixed wheat barley cropping systems, their climate resilience, and threats through their persistence. He also maintains a long-term collaborative research program along the Pacific Northeast coast of North America, focused on salt marsh gardens and other anthropogenic ecosystems. He recently started a new project with the Shinnecock Nation of Long Island to map plant resources on the reservation, and with Vixarica communities in Mexico to document and revitalize language-related ethnoecology. He is multilingual. He knows around 9 to 10 languages. I think this is the reason that he gets connected with the people very easily. Today, he'll be presenting on traditional plant management as resource sovereignty. A warm welcome to Dr. Alex Mackley. Over to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And just a note to the participants to be on mute as the talk is going to start. We're all excited for the talk and we don't want any disturbances. Also, if you have any questions, you can put it out in the chat box. We can take that in the question answer session. So without further ado, Dr. Alex, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Deepa, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Abdul Karim and Dr. Abdul Karim and Nishant for inviting me. I'm really honored to be chosen to give this talk today, and seeing all of these names, I wish I could have time to learn more about what everyone works on. I know that TDU has been a leader in traditional ecological knowledge and navigating different knowledge systems in conservation for a long time, and India as well has been a global leader in ethnobotany for a very long time. So I think more international connections are overdue, and I would love to explore connections with New York Botanical Gardens and TDU and other institutions. So I'm going to share some slides now. Can people see my slides?
Yes, we can see. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you again for the introduction. As I said, as Deepa said, I'll be sharing my work on traditional resource management as resource sovereignty in Mexico, Canada, and Ethiopia. I'm part of the Institute of Economic Botany at New York Botanical Gardens. We have a focus on medicinal plants, as well as conservation and traditional management going back decades. There are currently two other full-time curators in our department, as well as other members. So, oops, how do I advance this slide? Oops, okay. So first, in addition to thanking CCNR and TDU, I want to thank the members of the communities I work in, my collaborators from those communities, as well as other community collaborators and academic non-community collaborators. I want to thank the funders, National Science Foundation, McKnight Foundation, Atkinson Center, and Herbal Anthropology Project for supporting my work. So my research is broadly focused on how people in various cultures manage plants, plant communities, and ecosystems. As many of you know, indigenous peoples manage up to 1/4 of the land on Earth and an even larger share of biodiversity and carbon stored in forests. And over hundreds or thousands of years of observation and experimentation, they've developed locally adapted plant management practices. These practices include stewardship of otherwise wild plants, such as pruning of wild fruit trees, transplanting edible and medicinal plants closer to home, controlled burning and weeding around useful plants. But traditional management can also occur in agricultural systems through polyculture and intercropping, swidden agriculture, domestication, and selection. Traditional plant management can have both ecological impacts and evolutionary impacts. For example, controlled burning used by indigenous peoples around the world has shaped global ecosystems. And traditional selection and breeding has turned wild plants like teosinte, shown here, into diverse maize varieties. But when these practices cease, it can result in unexpected or undesirable consequences. For example, colonial suppression of traditional burning in the United States and Australia has led to the buildup of unburned fuel in forests, and as a result, uncontrolled wildfires that we see today. The narrowing of genetic diversity in our crops has led to vulnerability to diseases and other stressors that challenge food security. As a result, my work approaches the following questions. What traditional plant management practices are practiced around the world? What are the ecological and evolutionary impacts of these practices? What is challenging the continuity of these practices or their persistence? What are the implications for global and local resources? And how do these practices relate to food sovereignty? In other words, communities' control over how they grow and obtain their food and other plant resources. So today I'll share case studies from 3 of my research sites, Canada, Mexico, and Ethiopia. First, I'll talk about my work on ecological impacts of traditional plant management in the Pacific Northwest, studying how past management has shaped contemporary ecosystems. Then I'll talk about my work on evolutionary impacts of traditional management in Mexico on an introduced plant. Finally, I'll talk about eco-evolutionary impacts of traditional farming on wheat and barley in Ethiopia. But I'll start with my work in Canada on ecological impacts. In this region of Western Canada, Indigenous peoples have traditionally obtained food from intensively managing their landscapes in ways that did not necessarily resemble farming to European colonists. People would transplant wild bulbs, prune fruit trees, and burn to encourage berry bushes and attract game to early successional habitats, among other activities. In this area, there's been a transition of traditional foods to processed foods, and in some areas of the northern coast, seaplanes are the only means of access to major cities and food distribution hubs, which makes processed, externally bought food very expensive. This ties to food sovereignty since these factors challenge the control local communities have over their own food systems. In addition to food sovereignty challenges, many of these groups face challenges with land sovereignty. The Canadian government has treated any land that was not actively managed in its eyes as terra nullius, or empty land, and used that as a justification to take people's territory. Much of Western Canada's land has never been officially ceded by treaties from First Nations peoples to the government. But recently, studies on traditional plant management have been used as evidence to support Indigenous land claims in court cases. So in this region, we were interested in how past management has impacted ecosystems today, whether there is potential to revitalize some of these practices to support food security and food sovereignty, and what the implications are for land rights in some of these communities. So part of our work, we studied anthropogenic ecosystems, in this case, forest gardens. And this project was led by my colleague, Chelsea Armstrong, and many other collaborators were involved. So these forest gardens are not what European settlers considered gardens, but they're intensively managed sites. These forest gardens are sites close to villages, and there are ethnographic and archaeological records of intensive management by pruning, transplanting, and other activities that encouraged certain useful species like salmonberry and beaked hazelnut, shown here. So we were curious how these landscapes maintain their identity after over 150 years since abandonment, since many landscapes like this would have returned to primary forest over that time period, but these maintain their unique plant communities. So to clarify, today, these forest gardens are not actively maintained, and the last known forest gardens that were active are over 100 years old. So we carried out ecological surveys comparing plots far from the villages and close to the villages, and we found increased species richness close to the old village sites, with certain species that were especially associated with the area near the village, using indicator species analysis. Of those indicator species for village sites or forest garden sites, 7 out of 10 were very important edible species, unlike the village periphery sites. We were also curious what the traits and tendencies of the plants in those environments were. So beyond the species composition, instead taking a functional traits approach, we calculated functional diversity metrics, which can tell you something about the resilience against encroachment and invasion, as well as wildlife habitat and ecosystem services. We measured 4 traits, and we looked at 3 metrics. And 2 out of 3 of these metrics had increased values at the village core or forest garden sites compared to further away. Both of the metrics that were higher at village sites or forest garden sites were associated with resilience to encroachment by invasive species. Since the more functional diversity there is, the less niche space is theoretically available for introduced species. So these long abandoned forest gardens still, after at least 150 years, had increased species and functional diversity, as well as a disproportionate amount of edible plants. These anthropogenic landscapes are evidence for use and management in these areas, which are mostly territories that are never signed away by indigenous peoples. Several First Nations have begun projects to revitalize these food-producing ecosystems for food security and food sovereignty. So in summary, historical practices continue to shape ecosystems and historically increased the useful plant abundance. And there's potential for revitalization and support of local land rights. Moving from ecological impacts to evolutionary impacts, I'll next talk about the evolutionary impacts of humans on Brassica rapa. So we mentioned earlier the transition of wild plants to crop plants through traditional management, basically domestication. The results of this transition has been local and global diversity. For example, Zapotec farmers in Mexico plant multiple varieties of maize to manage risk. If it's a bad year for yellow corn, it may be a good year for red corn because of their different preferences and tolerances. Also, on a global scale, when we are faced with new pests or climate change related stresses, it's good to have a place to go to for more genetic diversity. Following domestication, there can be further evolutionary consequences of human management. Domesticated crops can escape and go feral. For example, weedy carrots and weedy rice are common in many landscapes as invasive plants. I will use the example of field mustard or Brassica rapa, which is thought to be native to Eurasia and North Africa. In Eurasia, it was domesticated for a huge variety of crops. It has also been called the dog of the crop world, since it has been selected for so many types of breeds. It was selected for oil seeds, flowering tops, leafy greens, and turnips, as shown here. And India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Himalayas are a very important place for this with yellow sarsen and turnips and other crops. At some point, Brassica rapa, either in a wild form or a feral form, was introduced to temperate areas around the world. So it's in Australia, it's in Africa, it's in the Americas, especially in highland areas, and it's classified as a noxious or invasive weed in many Latin American countries and some US states. A paper from 1979 caught my eye by Robert Bai, documenting the practices of raramuri farmers from northwestern Mexico. Not only did they adopt this as a wild edible food, but gathered the seeds to plant it again. He saw this as a rare case of ongoing domestication. Looking into the literature, I found that this is not constrained to this area, but at least 22 different cultures in Latin America engage with this introduced, quote unquote, invasive plant in some way as food, medicine, or other uses. We have this kind of trajectory from wild to domesticated to invasive to adopted to potentially re-domesticated. The top portion addresses global issues around food security and protecting our crops, but the bottom interfaces with local issues, potentially impacting food security for millions of communities in Latin America. I won't be focusing on the invasion history in this talk due to limited time, but I'll start by talking about the local food security concerns. So my questions were, how is it used and managed across the Americas? What are the evolutionary impacts? And what are the implications for food security and sovereignty? I chose Mexico as a study site because of the diversity of cultures that used it and because of Robert Bai's past work with the raramuri. I conducted interviews with members of 8 cultural groups across a transect of Mexico, representing diverse language families. And I was interested in whether linguistic affiliation, for example, the Nahua people of South Central Mexico and the Raramuri people of Northwestern Mexico both speak Uto-Aztecan languages, whereas the Tzotzil and Tzeltal of Southeastern Mexico speak a Mayan language. I was curious about when a new useful plant comes into a culture, how they decide to use or not use it, to manage or not manage it. I wanted to know if this decision was impacted by cultural tendencies in addition to simple geographic proximity. So this is an ordination analysis showing results from my surveys. And you can see that there's an affinity here in the central Mexico area towards the right of the diagram with Oto-Manguean speakers and mestizos. Southeastern Maya groups predictably came out close together with similar geographic and linguistic characteristics. But note that the Nahua and Raramuri also came out relatively similar despite their extreme geographic distance, hundreds of kilometers apart. This is not enough to demonstrate that this is a general pattern, but it is an interesting result that starts to paint a picture of how different cultures and communities adopt newly introduced wild or weedy or invasive plants. In my interviews, people from all the cultures I worked with said that it's an important food source, and members of every culture mentioned that it is available when other foods are running low. So in late spring and early summer, the last year's staple crops of maize, beans, and squash are running lower, and the next harvest hasn't yet come in. And so these greens and other related types of greens come up during that time and fill that food system niche. People eat both the flowering tops shown at the top right called flor de nabo and the leaves called hoja de nabo in Spanish. 5 out of 8 of the groups sell the plant, so they collect it wild or they cultivate it and sell it, especially for bird seed. So this is, it seems like it might be a minor income source, but it's actually rather important. And at big markets, for example, in Mexico City, you'll see huge mounds of these unripe siliques or pods. And many vendors told me that that it's said that these introduced pods make canaries sing and especially happy. Two of the groups recognized it as a medicinal plant for respiratory and digestive symptoms. And two groups recognized it as having a spiritual component, which I found surprising because of its relatively recent introduction only a few centuries ago. The Raramuri use this as a special food for the Semana Santa Holy Week festival, and the Zapotec use it to protect against evil eye. In no culture did I find that the farmers simply ate the plant when it grew. Instead, many reported managing the plant intensively. People would sow the seed in several cultures, transplant desirable phenotypes into their farms, or protect them from other weeds. Here's an example from the Raramuri territory where I worked with Robert Bai and did additional interviews. So you can see here they've sown this quote unquote invasive plant in dedicated fertilized parcels. In interviews, Raramuri farmers repeatedly mentioned that they preferred the delayed flowering, that they recognized variation for delayed flowering, and specifically tried to propagate individuals with delayed flowering because they liked to eat the vegetative rosette instead of the tough and bitter flowering plant. So I collected seeds and leaf tissue from a transect of the Raramuri territory to carry out a common garden experiment and genetic analysis of selection. I collected seeds from managed populations like this that had been planted by Raramuri farmers, as well as unmanaged populations along the sides of roads and in waste areas, and grew them in a common garden experiment, as well as subjected them to population genetic analyses. We found that there was an average of 2.5 more days to flowering from the plants grown out of the managed populations. And in one pair of managed and unmanaged populations in a community, we found an average of 7 days difference in flowering. So where does this leave us if we have these unique managed populations that people repeatedly told me were important for food and identity, and we have various Latin American governments and extension agents saying that it is a noxious weed that should be removed? So this is the tie to food sovereignty, the rights of people over their own food systems. As part of a larger workshop on traditional foods in Raramuri territory, I presented my work to representatives from the Raramuri community, several government agencies and universities to try and address and head off some of these potential conflicts of management interests. In summary, field mustard is incredibly widely used in Latin America, despite being an introduced weedy plant, with implications for food security in Mexico. Raramuri people may be actively domesticating this plant in real time, resulting in novel heirloom varieties, and also presenting a unique case study since most domestication happened over 5,000 years ago, and it's difficult to study in a cultural or ecological context. So we made an attempt to bridge these two perspectives and facilitate communication between government decision makers and the community expressed needs and preferences. So let's move on to talking about global food security and Brassica rapa. So I mentioned this example before when we have narrowing crop diversity and increased susceptibility to diseases and abiotic stresses. We often turn to wild relatives, which harbor more diversity than the genetically bottlenecked crops. And we also turn to land races from the center of origin of the crop, where there's often sizable diversity. A recent study modeled 65% yield decrease in Napa cabbage, also known as Chinese cabbage, in South Korea under climate change projections for the next 20 years, in a place where this is an extremely culturally important plant and the home of kimchi and many other Brassica rapa-based dishes. The problem with Brassica rapa is that we do not know whether the weedy plants growing around the world are wild or feral, and we didn't know the center of origin where diverse land races might be most concentrated. So we carried out a genetic study using genotyping by sequencing on 189 spontaneously occurring plants from global germplasm seed banks, herbariums, and collections from other researchers. We also sequenced 384 crop samples from 11 different crop subspecies to represent the crops. So to address this problem, the problem we have is that we expect a diversity bottleneck from wild to domesticated. So a reduction in diversity because a subset of the wild population is domesticated, and then the domesticated forms are often inbred, using this example of dogs, where you have many dog breeds that are inbred for generations, having congenital sicknesses and bad hips, heart problems, difficulty breathing, etc. But then we expect an additional potential diversity bottleneck when a species goes feral. So there's some exceptions to this, but in general, we would expect that the feral populations would be less useful for breeding because of this. Furthermore, we expect that the center of domestication will lead us to high diversity landrace forms. So one issue is that the wild relative collections had focused on Europe, assuming that they were truly wild. But our coalescent model suggests that the weedy field mustard in Europe and the Americas come out in association with European crops like turnips and broccoli rabe, whereas field mustard in Central Asia comes out sister to everything else and appears to be likely truly wild. This is corroborated by PCA analysis. In the middle, you can see Central Asian field mustard, and on the left, you can see other field mustard associated with European crops. So in the bottom right, you can see Toria, brown sarsen, and yellow sarsen from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan. In the top right, you can see bok choy and Napa cabbage from Eastern Asia. And then on the left kind of arm of this figure, you can see turnips from Europe, turnips from Central Asia, and leafy greens from Europe. So note that around those Central Asian wild samples in the very middle, there are two of the most nearby clusters are Central Asian. So from this, we recommend that conservation is prioritized in Central Asia compared with other parts of the world. We also tested different scenarios with demographic models to determine whether our genetic data supported or refuted those scenarios. They suggested a split around 5,000 years ago between wild and domesticated forms. Our evidence points to the Hindu Kush Mountains as a potential center of domestication for this crop, conflicting with previous hypotheses that it originated in Europe or in East Asia or both. So we then developed a niche model for roughly the same time period as domestication to see what the suitable habitat would have been like at the time. The Hindu Kush and other parts of Central Asia appear to have been suitable for this plant 6,000 years ago, as well as much of Europe, the Rift Valley, and parts of of Western China, for example. So in the dark, you can see the darker it is on the map, the better habitat suitability. Another interesting finding was that it looks like leafy types originated independently multiple times from turnip types. In Spain, they have grelos. In India, they have broccoli rabe. In East Asia, there's a very large variety of leafy types, including bok choy, Napa cabbage, mizuna, komatsuna, mibuna, and wu tai tsai, and many others. So we have this pattern emerging potentially of independent selection for leafy types out of turnips. So what are the implications of this? Well, we suggest prioritization for new collections of wild relatives, where we found the wild relatives to exist in the Caucasus Mountains. And we suggest prioritization of collection of crops like turnips and oilseeds from the center of domestication near the Hindu Kush because of center of origin there. So this swath of area from West Asia through Central Asia, starting to go into South Asia, appears to be very important for this species. So now we'll move on to the case of traditional agricultural management in Ethiopia, combining ecological and evolutionary impacts. The past two themes, forest gardens and managed weeds, have been perhaps on the border of wild and agricultural, but this work was on farms. We talked before about the importance of land races to global food security, but also we used the example of Zapotec farmers leveraging diversity of maize varieties to ensure risk management on a single farm scale. Remember, we talked about the yellow corn perhaps being tolerant to a stressor like drought or a particular pathogen, and the red maize being resistant to those but susceptible to other stressors, ensuring that at a subsistence smallholder farm level, at least some yield would be derived in a given year. So we were interested in questions about this diversity or agrobiodiversity. On-farm crop diversity is threatened by economic shifts with markets and cash cropping, government intervention and sustainable development, which may be well-intentioned, and cultural changes in food preferences. If we look at Ethiopia, it is somewhat interesting in that it is very heavily tilted towards small-scale agriculture. It is also anticipated to be hit very hard by climate change impacts, with some farmers already living in areas that are fairly marginal. We were interested in how farmers manage agrobiodiversity to mitigate their risk. Oops, sorry. That was an old recording when I thought I was going to give this asynchronously, but these are the collaborators I wanted to show you who are involved in the community members. So this was a very collaborative, large project. So for my postdoc project, I worked on a legume diversity study, as well as on these cereal mixtures. For the legume diversity project, this project trained 24 graduate students in Ethiopia who carried out interviews regarding legume diversity throughout the country, generating over 2,000 farmer interviews about legume diversity. One of our findings was that diversity, instead of being harbored on a single farmer scale, was often harbored at a community-wide or regional scale. You can see from this figure that one zone of Ethiopia where there's very high preference for one variety of common bean, Chele Gobo, and much less for Au Gobo, with a quick drop-off in other varieties. Since most farmers only planted one or two varieties, this total diversity is mainly held at wider scales. So an individual farmer, it would be very, very rare for them to have all of these varieties, which impacts how we think about conservation of this diversity and the strategy for conserving it. We also asked farmers about the traits of their varieties and found that there is, for example, high diversity in optimal yield across field pea varieties, but low variation for frost tolerance. So if climate change increases frost in this area, for example, it suggests that there may be limited adaptive capacity to deal with this change. This allows us to present our results to the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute and agricultural institutions of Ethiopia, which can then address this gap in diversity, perhaps by assisted transfer of land races from one part of Ethiopia to another. We're working with the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute and their legume diversity collections to try and communicate the importance of this indigenous agrobiodiversity. So for the cereal mixtures project, this is focused on polycultures. So on the left is a somewhat classic polyculture This one's from Mesoamerica, and it's grown in Mexico and Guatemala and nearby countries. And you can see there's a mixture of very taxonomically and functionally different plants that are very clearly complementary. So you have maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, the weedy edible plants I mentioned, like Brassica rapa, also grow in these systems. In this common North American mixture, maize provides physical structure, beans climb on the maize and fix nitrogen, and squash shades out weeds and retains moisture. On the other hand, this example on the right from Ethiopia shows a different case where you have multiple varieties of a single species planted in a field. Even less commonly observed worldwide is the combination of different species from the same family. For example, on the top example, we have wheat mixed with barley. In this case, multiple varieties of each. On the bottom, we have fava bean and field pea planted together in Ethiopia. In the latter example, fava bean provides physical support and field pea binds them together and acts kind of like a cage, keeping the architectural support of the plants. So South Asia is also a major center of these different polycultural innovations. And I'm very curious to know about examples of the cereal admixing. So these mixtures, specifically the cereal mixtures of wheat and barley, of multiple wheat species, wheat and rye, and of barley and oats, were historically very important to a much wider swath. From UK all the way to India, down to the Horn of Africa, people would mix cereal crops together. It's died out in many, many places, but is still practiced in Eritrea and Ethiopia, some Greek islands, the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan. I've seen older articles that mention it in India, but I haven't seen any newer articles. So I'd be curious if anyone knows about current use of this practice in the area. But we focused our work in northern Ethiopia on cereal mixtures. We were interested in understanding the extent of this practice, the benefits for farmers, potential for climate change resilience, and the factors threatening this practice's persistence. We carried out farmer interviews and market surveys in central Tigray and South Wollo zones. And we documented cases where farmers were planting up to 3 varieties of wheat and 4 varieties of barley in these extremely heterogeneous mixtures. Farmers treated these as a single crop when harvesting, saving, preparing, or sowing. We also documented a less common mixture of emmer wheat and barley rather than bread wheat and barley. And farmers almost overwhelmingly reported a better taste and texture from the mixture, from bread prepared from the mixture as compared with the prevalent breeder's variety of bread wheat. Farmers said that animals prefer it for fodder, perhaps because of the softer stems of the barley. And farmers reported a perceived higher drought tolerance and resistance to fungal rust as well. We're curious about the ecological and evolutionary interplay happening in these agroecosystems in response to climate change. Farmers say, for example, that their barleys were more drought resistant than their wheats, and wheats were more waterlogging tolerant and tolerant of flooding. They recognize variation across species, but also across varieties and within varieties. So when there are several years of drought, for example, and farmers are treating this as a single crop, one would expect some buffering on an ecological scale with species proportions shifting, and on an evolutionary scale with genotypes and varieties shifting. But 76% of farmers interviewed said its use is decreasing, and many cited the government's promotion of breeder varieties. We found that farmers with more frequent market access were 2/3 as likely to plant mixtures as other farmers. So this presents a potential challenge for food security. since if farmers are growing monocropped wheat with a relatively narrow tolerance compared to the mixtures, which might do better in marginal conditions, farmers might become more dependent on external aid and thus have their food sovereignty compromised.
Time is over.
So in summary, we documented the mixture to be widespread in the South Wollo zone and in Tigray, Central Tigray zone, where it had not been previously documented in South Wollo. Farmers expressed many different benefits compared to the sole cropped wheat, and there is potential for climate resilience. Our next steps are to carry out more interviews to get a better sense of the differences in practices across regions, to conduct field trials and participatory farmer experiments so that this traditional method is not erased before it can be properly studied. So instead of just assuming that these indigenous, locally developed practices are backwards or ineffective compared to the introduced varieties and introduced agricultural systems, we think that they warrant intensive study. And we plan to conduct a multi-year eco-evolutionary study to see how these mixtures compensate for different stresses by changing the composition over time. In conclusion, food and resource security at local and global scales are inextricably linked, in many cases, to traditional plant management. Some of these systems are robust, some are extinct, and others are under threats, while others still are being revitalized. Not only when these practices are threatened does it undermine sovereignty of the local communities, but sovereignty can also be supported by documenting the legacies of these practices. I want to thank the communities I work in, my collaborators, my funding sources, and all of you for your time. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alex. I think you took us on a wonderful journey throughout Ethiopia, and it was a really detailed but a simple way of telling as to how communities don't just use plants, but they have a very deep understanding of managing these. I have many questions, but there were a few questions that we had asked for the participants to send before the webinar starts. So I'll take that first, because those
Nishant, I just want to add, Nishant, one point I want to add. I really appreciate the analytical skill that you had on really analyzing the entire thing and putting it into a proper perspective. Very nice. I really enjoyed it, Alex.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So the first question is from Hyana Horokawa from Czech University of Life Sciences, Prague. So the question is, what are the possibilities of support management that a botanical garden specialized in medicinal plants established on the university campus managed by a non-governmental association? In both the cases, the botanical garden founded with the purpose of conserving ancestral knowledge system, documenting uses in the Peruvian Amazon propagated gram. So what is the difference that is seen or sensed between the state institution and the non-governmental one in their management? I hope it's clear, the question.
So I guess the state institutions versus the non-governmental role, it seems like there's great potential, and you see this with Kew Gardens is a great example where they have the Millennium Seed Bank, and they conserve so many different plant species, including ethnobotanically useful ones from around the world. I think that there's a great role for botanical gardens as seed banks and germplasm banks to complement existing germplasm banks around the world through including wild relatives. I think that would be a really appealing area because sometimes governments will have funding for that type of work, whereas governments might not have funding for conservation of plants that's unrelated to food. So thinking of ways to frame it in a way that governments find it valuable, I think, is important. I hope I answered the question a little bit.
Yeah. So the next question is, I think this is asked by Saumana Datta with respect to the farmers that you worked with. So the question is, are the farmers keen to grow cash crops as well as traditional varieties?
Right. So I guess it depends on where I went, but in northern Ethiopia, there's government interest in increased export economy, and so their plan is to promote these introduced varieties, which are very homogeneous and appealing to international customers, and then have farmers grow it and then buy it back from the farmers at a very good price, so that they can then sell it abroad as well as domestically. But I'd say that very, very few of the farmers that I interviewed had any cash crops. There's of course interest in market integration as well, and so part of the respecting of food sovereignty and resource sovereignty is not telling people they can't cash crop, but it's allowing them to make the decision of whether they want to grow the introduced variety or whether they want to grow the traditional variety. And as many of you have probably seen in the news, there's political conflict in northern Ethiopia in that Tigray region where some of these interviews were conducted, and that's going to have unpredictable but probably very disastrous impacts on the food systems and food sovereignty in that region.
Okay, I think that answered another two questions which were about cash crops. The next question is by Anup Chetri. He asks, what are the benefits when they grow multiple varieties of crops? Have you come across anything like that?
Right. So there have been a series of studies by Dr. Wolde Amlak from Eritrea, which is just north of Ethiopia and is culturally continuous. They speak the same language as in Tigray, Tigrinya. They've conducted intensive field trials with these mixtures versus the components of these mixtures separately. And they've found that there are increases in yield stability. So if there's a drought year and then a flooding year and then varied conditions through time, these will consistently produce better than the sole cropped components. So if you just grow the white wheat, it's less reliable than if you grow the white wheat and the black barley and the white barley. So there's agronomic evidence supporting these practices as well.
Okay, can we take a few more questions?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Happily.
So the next question is, I think you addressed this a little bit, but does the yield of the seeds increase when the wild variety is crossed with the domesticated one?
For the brassica?
Yeah.
Right. So that's a very interesting question. So in the part that I did not present on the origins of the invasive Brassica rapa, what we think is the origin is a cross between turnips, the domesticated turnips, and the wild relatives. So we think that crossed and resulted in these feral or escaped populations, because the wild species had adaptation to spread their own seed and grow in harsh climates, and the turnips had adaptation to agricultural ecosystems. So combined, you had these plants that grow very well in farmlands with lots of irrigation and fertile ground, but are also able to propagate themselves. So we are actually hoping to do some research on these escaped invasive feral Brassica rapa to see if they might have traits, for example, resistance to disease or increased yield of seeds compared to some of the domesticated forms, because they've spread from the far part of North America in Canada all the way to Chile and Argentina in South America. So across that gradient, we think that they have locally adapted to many different environments.
Okay. The next question is, it's about organic pesticides. Did you find any organic pesticides being used by traditional crop growers?
That's a great question. Yes. So one of the strategies which is very interesting and was brought to my attention by Dr. Zemede Asfa is a post-harvest pest management approach. So one of the traditional grains of Ethiopia is teff, and teff has the smallest seeds of any domesticated grain crop. And people will mix in some teff into their wheat and barley when they store it into the grain storage structure, and it prevents the weevils from getting in and eating the wheat and barley, because it's harder for them to get through since the holes are filled by small seeds. So I thought that was very innovative. Otherwise, I did not hear much about organic pesticides being used.
Okay, can I take one last question? It's from Luke. He asks, what about reintroduction of an indigenous species to a reclaimed wetland?
Great, yes. So that's very important. Also in the Pacific Northwest, so in Western Canada, there are these systems that are wetland systems. So you have in Western Canada, it looks a little bit like Norway or Sweden, where you have saltwater inlets or kind of fjord-like lands, and at the heads of those fjords, those inlets, are salt marshes, which are periodically flooded by salty water, which prevents the growth of a lot of different trees, but lets small salt-tolerant crops grow. And so traditionally, indigenous people in that area would cultivate and protect and transplant and heavily manage 4 or 5 different root crops in those systems. And so there are revitalization efforts to bring those traditional agro-ecosystems back to productive stages. So there's a lot of exciting work happening with that revitalization of traditional management for food security and sovereignty.
Yeah, I hope you've answered. Yeah. So there are a lot of questions that we got before the webinar on your experience in working in the New York Botanical Garden and how their efforts are trying to revitalize this entire system of traditional knowledge and your future projects. Everybody's very excited on what you're going to be working on. So if you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So New York Botanical Gardens has had this Institute of Economic Botany for decades, and it's been led mostly by Michael Balick, who's well known for his medicinal plant work. But over the last decade or so, he's been working in the Pacific Islands, and he's working with these culture schools, which are seeking to promote and keep alive the traditions. So these are community efforts that he's helping to facilitate with Gregory Plunkett, another garden curator, returning these manuals of traditional knowledge to the communities so that they can be held for many years to come, but also sharing them with healthcare providers who are working in the communities so that they can understand the cross-cultural challenge of healthcare. And then the other current curator is Ina Vandebroek, who is she's from Belgium, and she's been at the garden for about 15 years working on how traditional knowledge changes when people move from place to place. She edited a volume with Andrea Pieroni, who I believe gave a talk to you very recently, on traveling cultures and plants. And so this is a very hot area in ethnobotany, understanding how, for example, with Ina's work, how knowledge of medicinal plants has changed as individuals from the Caribbean have moved to New York City. You know, they don't have the same, yeah, exactly. Migration affects traditional knowledge. People don't necessarily have access to the same plants in New York City as they did in the Caribbean. So how do they adapt? How do they substitute plants? And how do doctors and healthcare workers in New York City understand the cultural sensitivity required to work with these New York City communities? And this is definitely an interesting question for, I think, India and South Asia, where you have diaspora, Indian diaspora in the island of Fiji in the Pacific, in you know, places like Suriname and Guyana in South America, and all over the world. It's very interesting to try to understand how people adapt their traditional knowledge, absorb new traditional knowledge from their new neighbors, and create new traditional knowledge from their encounters with plants and personal relationships with plants. But personally, my work, as Deepa mentioned, is moving towards traditional management in Mexico with the Wixárika people, and how it's encoded in people's language. There's an endangered language of Wixárika that contains quite a bit of plant knowledge and understanding of relationships between species, for example, like you know, the names for some plants are sour plant, so there's an ethnobotanical use encoded in that name. Or this is hummingbird plant, so you know the pollinator of that plant based on the name. So there's traditional ecological knowledge encoded in some of these names. And then working with a nearby indigenous tribe called the Shinnecock Nation in New York State, who they traditionally burned their forests to manage them in certain ways, and they had to stop in the 1970s, but elders still remember the practices. So we're looking into whether that could be maybe revitalized.
Okay, I think with that we'll have to wrap it up for this session, because we've already extended by 15 minutes. I hope that I can mail the remaining questions to you, Dr. Alex, so that there are some really interesting questions and you might want to answer them. So I'll mail it to you, and I assure the participants that we'll have all your questions answered. So before everybody leaves, I really request everyone to turn on their videos so that we can have a group picture. It's the least we could do for a social gathering. I know that during COVID times, we've all just been seeing the walls in our houses, and I'm sure we're all fed up by just looking at the walls. So I request all of the participants to switch on their videos and put up a bright smile if you enjoyed this session. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and like Dr. Karim mentioned, you took us to the beautiful landscapes of Ethiopia, and your analysis that you gave was commendable efforts. So thank you so much again from the entire TDU and CCNR team for giving your time and giving such an amazing talk. I'm sure the participants also, I express their gratitude on their behalf as well to you. So thank you so much, Dr. Alex. So participants, please, I hope all of you have switched on your videos. I should switch on mine. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you so much. Thank you,
so much.
Nishant. Thank you, Deepa. Thank you, Dr. Abdul Karim. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, I can see that all of you have switched on. So I'll take the picture at the count of 3. So 1, 2, and 3. I'll take a few more. So thank you everyone. As discussed before, we will be uploading this talk on YouTube. I'm sure all of you would want to listen to Dr. Alex again. I thoroughly want to. So we'll be uploading it on our TDU page. I'm going to be putting the link to our TDU page right here in the chat box so that you can go back and listen to this talk again. And if you have any questions, you can mail it to me so that I can forward it to Dr. Alex. So thank you, Dr. Alex, again for that wonderful talk. And thank you all the participants. We will be sending you the recording of the talk. As always, we say, please take care during these tough times. And we promise that we'll come back again soon with another interesting topic. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I would also like to announce that the next will be on the Malaysian biodiversity and ethnic culture. We'll wait and next will be on that series. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alex. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And I put my email in the chat. I'll put it in again if anyone wants to be in touch.
Yes,
Sure.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
As I said, I'd be very curious to hear what other people are working on and building
there are a
building
lot
more
of
connections between the wonderful South Asian ethnobotany and conservation work and what we are trying to do.
True.
Yeah, we were fortunate to have people from across different backgrounds and working in ethnobotany. So it was nice to have everyone. So thank you so much.
We're also getting a good perspective from all over the globe on different views, perspectives. It's very interesting to really learn a lot from different countries as such. And I got messages saying that some of the things we need to practice in our country, and we'll try to work on projects in such a way that we'll try to implement some of the ideas that we have mentioned. I've already got some messages from some of the colleagues, and yeah, we are very happy to. That's exactly what the learning is. We learn from a thing and see that how we adopt and try to come out with it. Yeah, and we are very happy about this. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I can also add, sir, that we'll also have some discussions with the New York Botanical Garden for some interesting studies or collaborations.
True.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we have so much to learn because I mean,
exactly.
I think that India probably has the highest per capita ethnobotanist ratio in the world. There's so many and people doing wonderful work that is not.
And you must be knowing that 4,683 ethnic communities are there in India.
Oh my gosh, linguistic and cultural diversity, and then the biological diversity is really important. Yeah. So absolutely.
Yeah, our sweet, which has been a similar sweet, which has been made by different ethnic communities, tastes differently. In a same state, in a same village. Wow. In a village, if you see, if there are two different ethnic communities, a sweet which has been made at home will be varying from one ethnic community to the other ethnic community.
So, yeah, so, and not just sweet, any recipe or any food time. Yeah.
Food, soups differs. Different soups of different people. Yeah, it's a very
yeah. There's so much that is out there that I hope it continues 100 years and 200 years into the future.
Yeah, that's what we are trying to see, that these recipes have been documented, and the chefs of this traditional who are coming out now, and the doctors in the case of hospitals where the nutritionists can adopt this sort of formulations that we are trying out in such a way that we don't lose that tradition. And we are doing the so-called carbohydrates that required by the international national standard or whatever is that, trying to take this recipe and see that how really it is fitting to that, and if it's fitting or not, but we will try to promote in a similar fashion and promote all these things in starting from the village level, and even in the nutritional and health level, and also in the case of in the form of a chef, there's that, all those things we'll try to do. We are working very hard on that. Yeah, today morning also we had a long discussion on that issues and how do we take this forward. Yeah.
Great. Well, this is such a wonderful series, and I hope it continues.
Thank you and guide us. I think that we need to really good people will try to call, and we'll have this discussions, and we'll take this furthermore. Yeah. Thank you, Alex.
So thank you, Dr. Alex. I know you must be going for breakfast now, as it's early in the morning for you. So and let's stay in touch. I'll keep you updated on.
Nishant, Sangeeta is also there. Can introduce.
Yeah,
proceed, Arlene.
Dr. Alex, this is Dr. Sangeeta from our center. She has done a lot of work on species using GIS maps. So, ma'am, this is Dr. Alex.
And I think Jagannath is also there.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
all of us can come online and maybe say.
Jagannath and
Ma'am, you're on
please-
mute. Sangeeta, ma'am, you're on mute.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Very nice presentation. I was very
Thank you.
impressed seeing those maps and such impressive work. Very nice. Thank you. We should be able to collaborate sometime. Yeah.
Let's be in touch. Very nice to meet you.
Sure. Jagannath is there. He's also our colleague, my colleague from CCNR. Is that Jagannath? He left or?
No, I don't see him.
Oh no. Okay, fine.
Well, we can follow up and have a future meeting. I would love to
Sure.
continue our
Yes.
dialogue.
Yes, sure. That's what we'll do.
Thank you, Dr. Alex. It was wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This is our small center, Alex, Center for Conservation of Natural Resources in university. So we have my colleagues, all of my colleagues who are working on different aspects. And it's very interesting, small, nice center. We are trying to work on, collaborate, do things, and a lot of good works we are trying to do. Today morning, we had a presentation on Sikkim state. We are trying to see that we have worked on 10 focal species, finding out exactly all aspect of conservation related things, starting even for up to the ABS, access and benefit sharing, up to that, starting from identifying the species to conserving in situ and ex situ, and at the same time seeing that it is leading to the ABS thing. We just all of us were involved in that presentation, and this evening we thought we in this webinar. Yeah, so
And I think we
you have
can
a lot of Zoom presentations.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Nishant,
I think we can take this opportunity to invite Dr. Alex Nusa to our university.
Of course,
and
why not? Why
yes.
not? Yes.
I would love to go.
Yeah,
So,
till all this COVID gets settled, we'll surely be
Yes.
able to invite you. Yeah, sure.
we have
Yes,
a good
I-
ethnobotanical garden, and we have India's largest medicinal plant conservatory, India's largest raw drug herbarium. So I'm sure you'll have a good time exploring something at the university.
So our herbarium is connected to the ethnic knowledge, not as a general herbarium as such.
Yeah.
We are trying to see that the ethnic knowledge has been connected towards the plants herbarium. So with
excellent.
the help of, you can search towards the Ayurvedic, the Siddha, the Unani, the traditional systems of India, and the ethnic information on any community-wise information which is there. And also we are trying to take this in a village level, how this information can be used for their health and livelihood security through Government of India, through the Prime Minister's office. We are trying to see that under the biodiversity mission, which we are trying to, India is trying to come
Wow.
out with it. We see that how this knowledge can really go to the village, where village can get benefit at the level of a taluka. We call it as a taluka here, as a province, what you say, a small taluka with a few set of villages. So some good work has been done. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have shared. We had a long conversation, sir, me and
Oh,
Alex,
good.
and in that,
Good.
I told about all FRLST's work in the past 25 years
Oh, good,
through
good.
PBRs and through community registers and
Oh,
through
good.
capacity building and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it strikes me as so important, and it goes beyond, the typical ethnobotany of
True.
simply document and take advantage of the knowledge. It's conservation, it's everything. So
True.
very, very big credit is due to TDU and all of you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to go have breakfast as you recommended, Ishant.
Okay. Sure.
But
Bye-bye.
thank you for having me, and
Thank you.
look forward to staying connected. Let's keep the momentum.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, to all the participants who are still here, thank you so much for joining again. We'll send you the recorded version of the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll send the feedback form shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nishant. It
Thank
was
you,
a
ma'am.
wonderful presentation
Yeah.
and good coordination by you.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you to you also
Yeah.
for that wonderful
Keep it up.
introduction.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you, ma'am.